Most of us know precious little about prehistoric humans, but a remarkable new novel inspired by modern genetic science and much informed by archaeological research bridges that knowledge gap with a deeply human and timeless story. Claire Cameron is the author of that novel, The Last Neanderthal. She's also a staff writer with The Millions, an online magazine of books, arts, and culture. And she joins us now. As I'm running out of breath, I have a cold, so if my voice cracks, just ignore it. Amazing book.
Thank you.
I could not put it down.
Oh, thank you.
And I know with this show, we read a lot of books, but I read this book in less than 24 hours.
And you have kids.
And I have kids. I've got two
fit
kids.
it all in there.
What inspired this book?
A few things. One was that I've always been fascinated by Neanderthals.
Mm-hmm.
I remember hearing a story by H.G. Wells called The Grizzly Folk when I was younger, and it portrayed Neanderthals as these monsters, like these cannibals and hairy and really scary. And I thought of them almost like monsters mm-hmm. as I was growing up. But then in 2010, the Neanderthal genome was mapped by a team of scientists. And that showed that people of European and Asian descent often have between 1% and 4% Neanderthal DNA. And that was astonishing, because here was a microbiologist mm-hmm. saying these people were much more like us than we previously thought. And my imagination just exploded with that.
When that news broke, what was the reaction like?
So I think a lot of people were astounded, but
mm-hmm.
it took a few years for the implications to start wrinkling through. So since then, a lot of studies have been done that have found artifacts that we thought were belonged to Homo sapiens are now Neanderthals. So a necklace is an example. Mm-hmm. And I think just now it's starting to come out into our popular culture as well, that we're starting to hear more stories. And like the New York Times had a front page story about how Neanderthals are a lot more like us, or that, it classified them as people, mm-hmm. which is a huge breakthrough.
I want to talk to you about why we've thought differently in the past, but I want to read something that you wrote in the book.
Okay.
It's because of their similarities to us that I can speak for them when I say that much of what you've heard isn't true. They were kind and clever. They had hands with opposable thumbs and a light dusting of hair on the backs. They had hearts that throbbed in their chests when they saw certain people, and this happened more than you might expect. Their brains were larger than ours by about 10%. Many of us have inherited up to 4% of their DNA, and now that both genomes have been sequenced, we know that theirs differed from ours by only about 0.12%. To be fair, these slight variations are significant. How are these variations significant?
So I was trying to establish for the reader similarities and signal to them that I'm going to breathe life into these scientific facts. Mm-hmm. So the book really takes this platform of scientific fact and evidence, and some of it is opinion, and it goes that step further. Mm-hmm. So a scientist has to stop speculating at some point, because they can't go beyond what the evidence is showing them. It's part of the rigor of their discipline. Mm-hmm. But I, as a novelist, my mind can wander. So I have a line in the book that says also that it's the things that don't fossilize that matter the most. Mm-hmm. So who you loved, or how you felt, what you saw, mm-hmm. these are the things that we really associate with making up the emotional part of our life. So the book really uses those facts as a platform mm-hmm. and goes that step further.
Where did you get the science from for the book?
I studied. I wish someone would award me like a BA in anthropology or something.
I thought because it's so
Yeah, it was. So I basically this discovery of the Neanderthal genome amazed me, mm-hmm. and then I started reading, and I thought maybe I'd read something about how, speculation about first contact, like how did Neanderthals and Homo sapiens come up against each other without killing each other first. That was kind of the story we grew up with. But the story isn't there, because it can't be, because it's again these things that don't fossilize. They're not there. So I started to realize that I could tell that story, but that it had to be informed. Mm-hmm. So I studied, I wrote a draft, I studied some more, I wrote another draft, and then I consulted a paleo archeologist named mm-hmm. John Shea, who's at Stony Brook University in New York. And he and I had this we call it the waste paper basket test. So he told me about reading another Neanderthal story. And when the science, when it went so against the science that it aggravated him, he actually threw the book over his shoulder and it landed in a waste paper basket behind him. So we called it the waste paper basket test. And he read through, and anything that he felt was off, he gave me citations and academic articles.
So do we descend from Neanderthals?
No. So we have a common ancestor, estimated to be about 400,000 years ago. We separated off from them. And then it's really a story of co-evolution. So they're more like close cousins that develop their own lineage alongside ours.
And where does this bum rap, when we think about Neanderthals, come from?
Well, I think we have, it's so interesting that it's taken us this long to come around to the idea that they were like us, because if you look at a Neanderthal skeleton, they're extraordinarily similar. There's some brow ridges and they have a larger nose cavity, but there's so many similarities. I think we as modern humans have this tendency to classify things as the other. And instead of being particularly interested in them, we use them to think about what makes us special. So when we were looking at Neanderthals, like an issue like, did they bury their dead? We used burying our dead as a way to define ourselves as sophisticated or more evolved, when in fact that behavior might even be in elephants, for example.
Where does this idea of superiority come from?
I think it's quite rooted in a misinterpretation of Darwin's ideas and survival of the fittest. So the idea it's convenient for us to think this way. So the idea that we went from primitive to perfect, and here we are in our glorious state. But actually Darwin's ideas were very much about survival of the best traits for those particular conditions. So you could have a slime mold that thrives in rain and it would do very well in a wet Toronto spring, and another mold that did well in dry conditions. So it dies off. One isn't necessarily better than the other. They're just two different kinds of molds. And I think that's increasingly what we're seeing with this story of Neanderthals, that it's not primitive to perfect. It's a much more complex story.
Well, in the book, you created life that was very realistic of a Neanderthal life. What was real in your book, and where did you take creative license?
Oh, it's a good question. So I'll use the example of speech. Neanderthals had a hyoid bone in their neck, so it's a U-shaped bone we all have that anchors the tongue, and it means we are able to form complex sentences. They also had a FOXP2 gene, which in modern humans enables communication and speech. But chimpanzees and orangutans, for example, don't have it. So that kind of points towards speech. So I thought, okay, I use that almost like a creative constraint. They probably could talk. On top of that, there's informed speculation. So a voice expert in England thinks that the way their voice box was positioned, their voices were actually quite high-pitched. We think of them as these grunting things, but she said no, probably quite high-pitched and forced, that it was hard for them to force out words, so they were loud, louder, or loudest in her words.
The writer in the New York Times piece described it as Julia Childs.
Right. Oh, yes, that was so funny. Yeah. An excitable Julia Childs.
Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah. So a high pitch. So I thought, in those, if you were forcing out a high pitched voice, you're probably not going to have chit chat the way we do. So I used those things as constraints that I had to work within. And then I thought, okay, so their culture is probably one more of quiet, and their other senses might have come out more, because I noticed that about myself.
That sense of smell that girl has in the novel is just fantastic.
Yeah, so I noticed, so I've done quite a bit of hiking alone in the wilderness, and I don't know if you've read Cheryl Strayed's Wild.
Yes.
Yeah. So, but I didn't write a best-selling memoir, but I did that kind of like hiking, and I noticed that when I talked less, my other senses really woke up.
Well, I'm from Africa, and we used to tell the time of day according to where the sun was.
Oh, yeah.
And when I came to Canada, I completely lost that.
Right,
I can't even tell. But even in
the season, too, because it twirls around.
Exactly. Yeah. And in the novel, you create a language, which we were just talking about. Did you consult with linguistics?
So My father was a professor in Old English, so I've always sort of grown up with the importance of language, and specifically how language shapes your worldview. I know this from friends who speak very fluently a few different languages. They say they're almost like a different self. So when I was trying to imagine the inner lives of Neanderthals, I started by writing a glossary to help get into their minds. And then I just used that as I went. But I did it all sort of intuitively and thinking that they were using language sparingly.
My favorite two words from there, warm and crow throat.
Yeah. Yeah, so my Neanderthals right now would call me a crow throat, that I'm babbling on way too much.
No, this is fascinating. So I would like to read something else from the book.
Wonderful.
You write, girl didn't know why the slashes were on the tree, but they weren't from an animal claw. They looked as though a body had been testing a stone tooth to see if it was sharp enough, but it was odd to cut into live bark. It hurt the tree, just like cutting skin. Its sap had bled and bubbled up from the wound. To girl, it was a kind of senseless violence. Why wouldn't a body test a tool on a downed log instead? The family injured bodies all the time, but only for food or fuel. This seemed to be neither. You gave girl, the character in the book, this inner life which allowed us to view the world through her eyes. Why would a marking on a tree be so confusing to her?
So I imagined her, you know how we all have sort of an inner narrator? So like I ate a cookie and then I get mad at myself for eating that cookie, but who am I talking to? Like there's no one, you know, it's me. So, but we have this separate sense of ourselves. Yeah. Maybe some people call it a soul, maybe some people call it your essence, whatever, but it's this idea like we have a separate personality from our body. So when I was writing Girl, I imagined her not having that separate sense of self. And I think 15 Dogs by Andre Alexis kind of gets into this, and very well-known Canadian novel where the dogs acquire language. And as they become more developed in their speech, they separate from each other and from the things around them. So, you know, if that's a table, I name it a table, it becomes an object that's separate from me. Whereas Girl, with this joined sense of self, is much more connected to everything around her and much more in the moment. She doesn't have this annoying narrator getting mad at her for eating cookies. So I imagined if you were more joined up with everything around you, you would have less, you would think you were less in control of your surroundings and less able to influence and maybe more sensitive to them as well. So it's not like she has a sixth sense, but she feels connected. That's the story she tells herself.
And where they live, there's a hierarchy. All the animals, it seems, they play a certain role. And in her family, it's led by her mother. Was this a matriarchal society?
I wouldn't go that far. So although I'm a feminist and I thought I can do what I want here. So
it's my book.
And yes, exactly. And so I thought that would be fun to play around with. My experience of how people, because Neanderthals, they think lived in relatively small groups and probably family units, although we don't know. And I thought, well, if you're in a small group like that and you have to get a certain amount of work done, you're going to choose the best person for the job. So when I was young, I was about 11, my father died, and I all of a sudden became the person in our family who could peel bananas and use a screwdriver. You know, I just stepped into that role, and I might not have otherwise. So my idea was that they had this strong matriarch who was very wise, and she was alive and wise. And I can imagine that passed down knowledge would be extremely valuable in that kind of society. So why not? Big Mother was the head of the family.
And then the story also involved another woman, and she's also very strong, and that's Rosamund Gale. Describe her to us.
So she is, so I was talking to you before about how Girl is quite joined up, so she doesn't have a separate mind and body. Rose is so headstrong. She's really led by logic, and she's determined. She's a woman in a field that has a lot of men, and she's doing very well. But just when the story opens, she's made this enormous discovery of two skeletons that are found in an embrace. And in the story, one's a Neanderthal and one's a modern human. So it's absolutely enormous. And the story is of her struggle to keep control of the site while pregnant.
They're both, well, each of them is in a different time. But one of the things that's another similarity between Rose and Girl is that they're both pregnant.
Yeah.
How do both characters deal with their pregnancies?
So I think there's some similarities, but there's a lot of differences too. Rose has a refrigerator full of food and, you know, things like central heating and lights, whereas Girl is out in the wild. And those are, I remember when I was having my kids, it's such a raw and primal experience, but I also had the thought of like, thank goodness I'm in a hospital and that sort of thing. But I think that Rose, in a way, is at some disadvantage because she's so disconnected from her body in a way, and she doesn't ignore her pregnancy, but she thinks of it as something that's just natural and going to take care of it, and so she can go on and organize her life. Whereas Girl realizes that everything's changing because she doesn't have modern conveniences to bolster or help her delude herself. And
how do they both react to childbirth and motherhood?
I think they both go through you know, they realize that their identity is changing and they're both struggling with that. And that's something that certainly caught me off guard. And that's sort of from my own experience that I all of a sudden became, in my own eyes, but also in the eyes of society and people around me, a very different person because I had a child. And it was quite a confusing thing to go through. So one of my aims in the book was trying to explore what happens through two totally different lenses.
And it's surprising that Rose, you would think that because she's in a time when she has all this access to medicine and all this, that she would have an easier time at it, but it seems as if Girl fares better in a way.
Yeah, in a way. Yeah. I guess Girl has more emotional support. I think what the story I hear from a lot of women, especially women who have worked and who are ambitious, which can even be a bad word sometimes to call a woman ambitious, or it has been. I hope that's changing. It's very isolating because you all of a sudden, you're very capable and doing things in the world, and you all of a sudden get cut off and sort of you're in your own little bubble with this baby. And the more I worked on the book, the more I started to realize that, you know, we're the only species that delegates the gathering of food. So by that I mean you go to an office or wherever you work and you make money to buy food. But all of a sudden you're you know, maybe you don't have good maternity leave or whatever else, or if you're not paid properly, you get cut off from the means of existence in a way, and it leaves you vulnerable.
And this idea, because with Rose, even though she lives in a place where she has access to all these things, her concern is, how am I going to pay for the birth?
Yeah.
And then with Girl, she knows how to find food and all those things if need be.
Yeah.
But there's also a scene in the book where each mother nests before giving birth.
Yeah.
Something I guess we all do. How does that experience differ across 40,000 years?
Well, this came out of my experience, and this all my friends that have had babies either move or you know, renovate, or they do something radical.
But it's like this urge you can't control.
You can't stop, and you know it's the worst timing, but there you are in IKEA, as my characters go to, and it's so funny because quite a few of my one friend actually started calling me from IKEA, and she'd say, "We're not fighting," and she and her husband would be there, and then I'd get this call 2 days later, and it turns out they were missing a screw, and like all heck broke loose, right?
Yeah, when you wrote that they were going to IKEA, I'm like, don't do it. Your relationship was already fragile.
Well, and I wonder about this because it's in the way it's hilarious that we live out these old instincts through flat pack furniture, but I do wonder how much we're trying to satisfy these like very sort of ancient drives, you know, through very modern means, and it creates this odd. It's hilarious, actually. Yeah.
When one has Neanderthal DNA, would that have occurred from our common ancestor 400,000 years ago, or from when our two species interbred?
So this is one of those stories that's changing as we speak, pretty much. So So they think the DNA, like the 2.5% that I have, is
because you had your DNA tested.
I had my DNA test. Yeah, it was 2.5. I wished I was higher for
Why?
some reason. I don't know. I just wanted.
You wanted to be more Neanderthal?
Well, and I think also doing the DNA test, it was kind of like a trick of the mind. Like, you know, how do you write about people who are 40,000 years gone? You know, and so just there was something about fooling myself into having Neanderthal DNA that would help me. But I think, okay, so 40 to 50,000 years ago, they think there was interbreeding, and that's where we're seeing DNA from. But there's increasingly a more complex, because these tests are done from just a few samples. Like I think many of the ones done right now are 2 thigh bones or something from 2 individuals, one in one place, one in another. So it's a very limited sample. So they're starting to, as more work is done, they're starting to think that the DNA there may have been extended periods of interbreeding.
Is there a danger in finding out how much Neanderthal DNA one has?
I think those tests in general call up some issues. Especially, I mean, things often start in health too, right? And so you can get DNA tests that will show you if you have like the variant for Alzheimer's or something. So I think that knowledge we have to be responsible with, and maybe there could be prejudice against Neanderthal DNA. I hope we're rehabilitating their reputation more than that. But I think anytime as humans, we're very good at typecasting, aren't we?
Yeah, we are.
So it's a danger. Yeah.
What are some Neanderthal abilities that would surprise us?
Well, there's a lot of debate about their eyesight and this slightly larger brain capacity. Was it because they had bigger eyes and enhanced vision, and the extra brain power went to that? Or there's any number of things. My Neanderthals they lifted up their top lip and they could sense things, you know, in the breeze, and that I completely made up. But it was just part of my trying to enhance I read about this research about the eyes, and I thought, well, you know, it does make sense that living outside that they have enhanced.
Did you make up that part too about the smell?
Well, their sense of smell I enhanced. So that's another thing. There's a lot of debate about whether we're losing our sense of smell or it's the same. And it's one of those, you know, each expert you talk to will talk about something slightly different. But to write this book, I really went for those controversies. So, you know, did they bury their dead? Did they speak? What were their senses like? It's back to this thing of human specialness, that we've been so concerned about why we're different from animals. And language, burying your dead, all those sorts of things have been used as markers that show why we're superior.
Neanderthals also cooked?
They did, yeah. So they found, there's amazing microbiology that goes on around sites and, you know, looking at what so they had control of fire.
What happened to them? Why did they go extinct?
That's the big question. And to write this book, I was sort of trying to avoid that for a long time, but I came to see that I had to have a theory. And as I'm not an expert, I went with the expert opinion that made sense to me, which is that they were very thin on the ground. So they lived in small family groups, and there was maybe 100,000 of them across Asia and Europe, you know, at their peak, which is not very many individuals. So like us, they were beasts that lived through collaboration. They need other bodies to live. So if you get any sort of disease, introduction of another, you know, of modern humans, for example, or climate change, drought, they're very susceptible.
And I think, for me anyway, the most lyrical parts of the story is when you were describing what happened when a human and a Neanderthal met for the first time. It could have happened so many different ways. Why did you decide you wanted them to meet in, I guess, a sense of wonder?
That came from 2 things. One, that we grew up with this idea of that we killed the Neanderthals off. And it certainly how I learned it was very violent and sort of a conquering story. But the story we hear a lot less is maybe there wasn't as well. And these were, rather than think of them as a block of people, there was this varied, there were varied individuals. And I think part of retelling a history is about getting to know individuals and that they're all different and distinct from each other. So I thought this whole book was sort of about a circumstance where a modern human and a Neanderthal might meet and actually have something in common.
Is it a coincidence that Neanderthals disappeared just as humans started to migrate to Europe?
Yeah, I think that's, and I worked a bit with Yuval Noah Harari, who wrote *Sapiens*, and I know he's been on the agenda, and he asked me about that as well, and his book very clearly establishes mass extinctions anywhere humans go. I think that absolutely they were another pressure on Neanderthals, but it's important to remember that modern humans also went off at like a pinch period about 70,000 years ago. So we nearly died off, and they think went down to, I've heard, as few as 1,000 individuals, but managed to spring back. So I think it's, I'm sure we had some role to play, or whether we took over the choice spot in the salmon spawn or whatever. But also, I think that evolution, it's important to keep in mind that evolution isn't about superiority. It's about adjusting to the conditions, and that we nearly died off. And, maybe it's more to chance as well.
And it took you 5 years to write this book, right?
Yeah, and with research and many, many drafts.
Now, looking back at everything that you've done and reading the book, has this reinforced your love of Neanderthals?
Oh, yeah. Oh, all the more. Yeah. Because they became so much more than just skeletons or monsters. To me, they became real people. And in a way, writing this book, I developed a great sense of loss that they're gone. And, with recent discoveries, it's clear that we used to have many other of our kind wandering around. So Homo erectus or Neanderthals, or the new one, Homo naldi. But now we're alone. And I wonder about that. We're one of the few species that doesn't have any other like us.
It's something to think about.
It is.
Thank you so much, Claire, for being here.
Wonderful,
wonderful book.
Thank you.
Help TVO create a better world through the power of learning. Visit TVO.org and make a tax-deductible donation today.